As of today, it was well established that video games are dominating the entertainment industry. The stats alone report that the video games industry has gotten even bigger than the movies industries or music industry. We have been seeing a lot of movies and TV shows like Sonic the Hedgehog, The Witcher HBO show, and now the recently announced The Last of Us show, which is coming in the future. And among these movies and series is the Resident Evil film series. The Resident Evil series is the only successful series to increase the amount of money made with each successive film. The first Resident Evil movie goes way back to 2002, and a series even way more back in 1996. So to have the most successful movie series in the history of video game movie adaptations, Resident Evil game series itself should also be a great series, doesn't it? Well, in fact, arguably the most successful game series to be ever created. Resident Evil series comes from the famous Japanese game developer and publisher Capcom, as it's one of their flagship games franchises. The very first game was first developed under the name Biohazard, and would have still been popular in that name if the name wasn't already taken by the American band or another DOS game, though the game is still published and known under the name Biohazard. The name Resident Evil was introduced as it's being used in the rest of the world. The very first game made its debut in 1996, and since then 10 more main titles have been released, making a total of 11, and the whole games series rounds up to a total of 25 games, including the secondary titles as of 2020. Resident Evil has played a very important part in the history of video games, as it's the reason for having scary and story-driven survival horror games today. Resident Evil redefined and reintroduced the genre of horror survival with an innovative take on the games by introducing how horror is infused with puzzle and survival, and how delivered to the audience with a great plot. A lot of the video games today, including The Last of Us, are inspired by the Resident Evil, and that's why it's the most important and arguably the best game franchise to ever have existed. So coming to the games themselves, the first Resident Evil title was a great success. It went on to be the best seller in a few regions, and the game was so successful sequels were destined to be made. Resident Evil's first entry is a fan favorite to date, and later went on to getting a remastered as well. A distinct nature about the first few titles of the series is that the gameplay was mainly focused on a puzzle-solving experience that complemented the horror nature of the game and made the whole game series unique and scarier than the other horror games which were out in the time. However, the only thing wrong or outdated is these first few titles was just the use of the camera. Now, if you try to play today, you might find them really strange and almost unplayable as to the point, as the camera's angles were fixed. However, this can change from the player to player. Nevertheless, this added some extra difficulty to the game, and as for the games at the time, it wasn't that big of an issue at all. This went on to continue until the sixth main title of the series, Resident Evil 4, which introduced a third-person perspective with a more dynamic camera to the game. The fourth title was Code Veronica, and the fifth was Resident Evil 0, just for the reference. Remakes for the first few titles, Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, have been made, which has added the current-gen dynamic camera to the game and enhanced the overall experience from the original games. The latest remake being the Resident Evil 3, by the way, it's looking simply amazing. And so if Capcom is going in an order with the remakes they have been doing lately, next in the line is the fourth main title of the game series, Resident Evil Code Veronica. The very first question one might ask by just looking at the game's title itself is, why is it the fourth game named Resident Evil Code Veronica and not Resident Evil 4? Well, there's important reasons behind this decision, and we'll get into it in a bit. Resident Evil Code Veronica is also a survival horror video game released in early 2000s in the same legendary series as the fourth major installment. The game was confirmed and revealed in 1998, and though it wasn't numbered title as the series' previous game sequels, Code Veronica was promoted as a true sequel to the Resident Evil 2. The game was initially set to be released in September 1999, around the same time as the Resident Evil 3. It was delayed though to February 2000. The game marks another importance as it was the first time a title of the series was released on multiple other platforms apart from the PlayStation. But still, how did it end up being a major title of the series? It can be assumed that the production of the game was unintentional at first. The developers were trying to port the Resident Evil 2 to the Sega Saturn game console when they realized it wasn't possible. Then the developers converted it to a brand new title and continued the development of the game. Though the game is kind of a spin-off, developers have stated that the Code Veronica was a true sequel to the Resident Evil 2. And since the name Resident Evil 3 was taken by another game that was being developed right around the same time, Code Veronica was left to go with a different name. So, if the development of the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis hasn't been started or happened around the same time as Code Veronica, we would have gotten the game Code Veronica as of Resident Evil 3 instead, and one more numbered title would have been added to the franchise. Now enough of the story about the game, let's continue to the story in the game. If you haven't played the game already, this is a warning for the spoilers which are coming ahead. The story happens 3 months after the events of the Resident Evil 2. The game is knitted around Claire Redfield, who is protagonist of the game. 3 months after the escaping Raccoon City, Claire is set off to find her brother, Chris Redfield, is an Umbrella Corporation provision in Paris. She's discovered and captured by security as is imprisoned in a prison on a Rockfort island. She's then released by prison staff upon the epidemic of the T-virus, and is forced to escape the island due to the mayhem of the situation, alongside another prisoner named Steve Burnside. In their trying to find a way out of the island, they meet the island's commander, Alfred Ashford. So talking about Alfred, he has a twin sister, Alexia Ashford, and their story is just as wicked and horrible. The long story short, they were born as a result of the genetics project conducted by their cousin, Alexander, in hopes of the surrogating child would carry out his father's virology research. So Alfred was born as a failure of an experiment, but his sister was a genius. Then they had sent to a lab in the Antarctica, where they find the secrets about their birth and before splitting up for good. Alexia decides to carry out the ultimate part of the research, where she injects herself with a T Veronica virus and goes into the cryostasis. So back to the main story. Claire and Steve manage to escape the island, but Alfred decides to join them and change their route to Antarctica, where his sister is in a deep cryogenic sleep. The facility in Antarctica is swarming with zombies, and they fight their way through the zombies to escape. Alfred gets wounded during the fight, and before he dies, he frees his sister, who is also injured with the T Veronica virus, and Alexia manages to recapture Claire and Steve. While their crazy events are happening, Chris Redfield, brother of Claire, gets to know about his sister via Leon and starts researching for her on the island. He meets Albert Wesker, who is the main antagonist in the whole series, and he's searching for a sample of the T Veronica virus himself. After Chris learns about his sister and Wesker learns that Alexia is alive and she carries what he needs, they both travel to Antarctica on their own different expeditions. Finally, Chris manages to free his sister, and they both search for Steve, who is infected by then and tries to attack Claire. He fails and manages to get control of the virus for some time, but he gets fatally wounded in a fight where he finally dies right after he confesses his love to Claire. Finally, Chris manages to defeat Alexia and escapes with his sister, and Wesker manages to salvage Steve's corpse for the experimentations. The Antarctic self-destruct after all of this happens. The whole plot does make good sense, is relatable to the series, and how everything's put together to make one good story is just amazing. So far everything looks just perfect, until we get to the gameplay part. Well, don't get me wrong, the game was just as amazing for the game that came out in 2000, but as I mentioned earlier, every game before Resident Evil 4 had less dynamic cameras, which is the only downside of the game in a technical aspect. The fixed cameras might actually be preferred by some players, but in a technical point of view, the third-person or first-person view really matches the genre of the survival horror. Nevertheless, unlike the pre-rendering backgrounds and models of the previous games, Code Veronica introduced real-time 3D environments and dynamic camera movement. Apart from that, the overall gameplay is pretty similar to the previous games, and includes all the classic Resident Evil elements like the puzzles, controls, and combat mechanics. However, the 3D environment affected the experience in a good way, as the cameras could be more dynamic and zoom or rotate without the obstacles. The game also brings two playable characters, Claire and Chris, which has also been done before, but still a cool addition to the game. So, does Resident Evil Code Veronica deserve a remake, and why? Well, before jumping into any conclusions, let's analyze a few more information. How well received was the original game back in the day? Well, as expected, and as a Resident Evil main title always do, it nailed some really good rating scores from the popular game critics at the time. As a matter of fact, some even believed that it was the best entry of the series up to date. Another notable praise of the game was the graphics it brought to the console, like the Dreamcast. Some even said it delivered the best Dreamcast graphics at the time. However, this was just for the Dreamcast version. Capcom, knowing that this wouldn't be enough to keep the sales expectations, released the game to extend the cinematic scenes and some graphical enhancements for the PlayStation 2 in 2001, named Code Veronica X. It was then released on some other platforms later on. A HD remastered version of the game was later released late 2011 for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and can still be played on a current-gen console due to the backwards compatibility. And so how does the sale go? The Dreamcast version of the game sold around 1.14 million copies worldwide, with almost 450,000 of them being sold in US. This doesn't come out as a big number comparing to the previous games, but it's a great win comparing to the other Dreamcast games. The PlayStation 2 version of the game went on to sell 1.4 million copies worldwide. All the versions combined went on to sell over 3.7 million units worldwide. So considering and analyzing all these facts, it is safe to assume that Resident Evil Code Veronica is a really good game for its time. The game delivers a pretty good story and a real-time 3D environment, and improvements of the graphics add value to the game as well. As I mentioned previously, the only downside to the game is its fixed camera features. So it's pretty obvious that the current gen gamers prefer those dynamic third-person perspectives in their survival horror games. So that's one reason why a remake of the game should be done. Another reason why the game deserves a remake is because of the Code Veronica featured some of the best cutscenes of any video game at the time, and considering how good the recent remakes of the Resident Evil 2 and 3 looks. Code Veronica would be undoubtedly makes a really good game with a very good cinematic experience. And finally, the next reason why it should be remade is simply because if Capcom is going in order of releasing of the games with their remakes, Code Veronica should be the next game in line, which is to be remade. The sad news is that there are currently no news about the remake of the game, and there have been no confirmations stating that the remakes even is in the production. So if Capcom decides to do one, it would take years before we could play it. Anyways, if you have enjoyed this video and if you'd like to see more similar content, please do take a look at my playlist. Also includes the why Resident Evil 4 deserves a remake as well. I have finally made a Patreon. With your support, with just $1, you can make these big videos possible. Please be sure to take a look as it includes extra rewards as well. Lastly, I wanted to give a big shout out to Raven Star. With $6.60 per month that he is pledged with, thank you so much, and I really do appreciate it. And at that, thank you so much for watching, like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.